Good evening. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for being still here after these very intense debates we are having. I'm Sabrina Marchetti from Foscari University of Venice. I have been the leader of the Italian team of the research that's been carried out in Italy during those 3 years. Of course, I want to thank very much everybody that made this final meeting possible, all the organizing committee, Luke, first of all. Today, we are discussing one of the key points that, in this 10 key points report. As a team, we have decided to present something on the working conditions of people who are in the centers. So this was just briefly mentioned before. We are nicely following up on that. This is probably not something that came up from the first part of the research. It was not one of the first outcomes, but especially after the stakeholder workshop that we held in Italy, the VULNER project had one workshop with national stakeholders in every country. We carried out our own workshop last November, and Giulia Garofalo and Pamela Pasian, who are here, who are part of the team, were particularly involved in organizing and leading that workshop. So with them, it came up the idea of working on this issue for this final moment of debate with all of you. So I'm leaving the floor to them for presenting this part of our research. Of our team today is with us also Letizia Palumbo, who's going to present tomorrow another part of, the work package that she coordinated from Italy. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay. Solo l'altro, perfetto. Okay, thank you, Sabrina. Thanks, everybody. So I'm going to be on this side, maybe just... Yes, of course. So we are very happy to present a theme that it's close to our heart. Also because we have to say some of us are academics, but also have worked as social workers in reception centers in Italy. And as Sabrina said, the topic emerged during the fieldwork, but also during the moment in which we presented our results to social workers and other stakeholders in Italy. So we are very happy today also to discuss this issue with two discussants. So we were supposed to have also another discussant, Catherine Woollard from ECRE, European Council on Refugees and Exiles, which is very sorry, but she couldn't be here today. But the first of our discussant is Raffaella Greco Tonegutti. She works now at the Belgian Development Agency, but in general has been working as a consultant and expert on migration and human rights, including in Europe and Africa for the European Commission for the United Nations, and also she was in charge of a EU-funded project that hopefully she will refer to, published in 2015, really engaging with the quality of public service and migration across different countries in Europe. We're also very happy to have Tuscany Bell from the European Public Service Union. The European Public Service Union is a confederation of unions across different countries. So, and the union has been dealing with issues, of course, of work, pay and working conditions related to the quality of services. In particular, stressing also in recent years the problematic issues of privatization of migration and refugee services and other forms of state disengagement, which did emerge in our findings indirectly, but we are also very happy that to have that specific contribution from you. So we are going to present our so this is the tech Okay, so as Sabrina mentioned, this is a teamwork. So here are our names. Also, we want to remember that Danica Nassale was involved in VP4, so the work on Italy for a long time. Now he is not with us anymore, but I mean, in the sense that he's in another job. No, and he cannot be here today. He's doing other very interesting work. So these findings are included in the key message number 3 of this publication that we want to also thank Kate and Peter for your help with this publication, which is really great. So our fieldwork was in 2 regions in Italy, so not all of Italy, but 2 quite different regions, Veneto and Lazio, and it took place especially regarding the part that we are presenting today in 2021. So it included ethnographic observations in reception centers, but also help desks supporting protection seekers and NGOs. Also, it included in-depth interviews with 37 protection seekers and refugees, and 27 among practitioners, social workers, psychologists, and other experts. The year before, there was a deep work of interviews with 50 institutional and legal actors. So in this work, we found that migrants especially stressed the role of reception center workers, as in social workers, but also language mediators and other staff who interact with residents as a central element in their definition and experience of vulnerability. So they told us how, something we knew, but a description really of how these workers are gatekeepers, provide services, support, information, translation, and we are also, from the perspective of vulnerabilities, situations of vulnerabilities, also we're talking about support and connection, for instance, in Italy with referral mechanisms, for instance, with the anti-trafficking system, or psychological specific forms of support. And also, of course, information and somehow involvement with your own application, with your own, procedure, asylum procedure. So a trusted and reliable reception center worker really is decisive, according to our findings, in the experience and also in the possibility of success of an application and of somebody being able to move forward and building their future. However, when centers are, as it often is the case, understaffed, with low pay, long hours, and no training, this creates not only serious difficulties for the workers, but can exacerbate situations of vulnerability. So this becomes, I think, very relevant also for our specific research. So in Italy, so this is findings that somehow, along with our colleagues also from other countries, we found that are to a certain extent true for other contexts, but part of today is also to share experiences and what's going on in other contexts. As for Italy, really there was a clear message from every interviews we had with social workers and many of the migrants interviewed, a real worry about these working conditions, especially, in general, but especially in a type of centers which are called CAS, so extraordinary reception centers, which is to give you a few information for those of you who are not familiar with Italy. They usually house average of 50 residents, but they can go up to about 300 residents. The main characteristic is that they are often isolated in isolated areas, rural areas where people are disconnected from the rest of society. They are centers designed for emergency situations, that were designed originally for emergency situations and short periods, but in fact, they represent today the majority of reception centers in Italy. According to a research that is done annually by Open Policy and Action Aid in Italy, in 2021, 7 out of 10 of the migrant seeking protection that were registered in the reception system lived in CAS, so in this kind of centers. And what is clear is like this hyper development of these extraordinary centers is due to public cuts and disengagement of public authorities as service providers. This has become very clear in Italy after a reform called the Salvini Decree or Security Decree in 2018, where there were significant cuts related to special integration measures for immigrants seeking protection. And we recently have had a new reform that, we still have to see the consequences of, called the Cutro Decree, passed just now in May 2023, unfortunately called after the boat disaster that you may have heard, of course, at the end of February in Calabria with 94 dead people. Anyway, this kind of decree also goes in the same direction of that past decree, and so we expect similar consequences in terms of specifically of CAS having less and less resources to support migrants, all migrants, including those with vulnerabilities. So what we see is like with these very limited resources, there is, in general, working conditions have decreased, and specifically the ratio, so the ratio between workers and residents has decreased, and the capacity to do social work has minimized. And we identified really a change in the character of social work that has been happening, unfortunately, from a work that is supposed to be on supporting and facilitating social and labor market inclusion to a work that is de facto disciplinary and guardianship. The residents report the regulations that the social worker, the reception center workers have to enforce, in fact, deny their agency, their privacy, impose excessive discipline or forms of infantilization, and impede social independence and social interaction with society as a whole. Also, it's important from a social work perspective to stress that workers often do not have, especially in CAS, quality supervision and job support, which is something crucial for social work, as we know. And this associated with the fact that there is a high staff turnover rate and the fact that the low pay is not attractive to train individuals, it results in staff often feeling helpless, stressed, and burnout, heavy kind of, we can say trauma to a certain extent, I think. And of course, also the high staff turnover means that all the channels that are, built, day by day between institutions and the cooperations with service providers, when there is a change in the staff, of course, all of that work is erased, So that's what I wanted to say. Now I give the floor to Pamela Pasian to continue.
Thank you, Giulia. Thank you, everybody. So, reception center workers are on the front lines of supporting people who have experienced trauma and are subject to intersecting factors that put them in position of vulnerability. Yet, they often don't have the time or training to identify or address the risks and challenges faced by those for whom they have a duty of care. In this context, hidden or more complex intersectional vulnerabilities are often not identified and or addressed concretely. The lack of training for those working at the reception center is another interrelated factor that can create or exacerbate situation of vulnerability for migrants. A lack of training was reported on topics including gender-based violence, LGBTQIA+ issues, intercultural communication, trauma, youth, anti-racism, discrimination, smuggling and trafficking, and exploitative labor. The lack of care for reception center workers is particularly problematic in the context of profit-driven third sector organizations that are operating in the asylum, refugee, and migrant reception sector. Many of which, along with the workers they hire, lack the necessary skills and experience to provide adequate support for the vulnerabilities faced by those in their care. Since the funding cuts in 2018, these organizations have dominated the service supply in Italy, as Giulia said before, with the majority failing to offer any form of social and labor integrations, support for reception center residents. Our findings indicated that some of them even operate below legal standards, failing to provide basic services such as language mediation. In the Italian context, we found that some asylum seekers and the refugees find themselves in situation of serious exploitation as they try to secure a dignified living condition by making money through jobs in the informal sector. As a result, some CAS reception centers have openly become places to recruit cheap workers, especially for poorly paid and unregulated sectors such as agriculture. In this context, reception center workers are unable to build and sustain a setting in which residents feel safe to talk about experiences such as violence, abuse related to gender and sexuality, trafficking, and forced labor or health conditions. Without stable and adequate work conditions and regular training and supervision, reception center workers are left with extremely challenging and stressful jobs, which can even lead to trauma for all involved. This context inhibits their ability to provide effective support to those for whom they have a duty of care. This is a quote from the stakeholder workshop we held in Venice in November. This social worker expressed perfectly our key message. And she said, how can you ensure quality care? How can you assure high-level professionalism when you have to think about how to make ends meet, or whether your contract, you don't know if your contract will be renewed or not? So our recommendations are the following. So institutions responsible for the funding and the management of reception centers should improve working conditions. Institutions should guarantee fair working conditions, including better pay, longer-term contracts, and a more manageable rate of workers per resident. Institutions should invest in training, should guarantee regular and varied training for reception center workers, including on how to assess vulnerabilities faced by migrants seeking protection, including hidden vulnerabilities through an intersectional lens, and on how to decrease everyday forms of racism and discrimination. And again, we believe that institutions should share best practices, and they should ensure that workers can regularly participate in group meetings with other workers and supervisors to exchange and learn from shared difficulties and about best practices for supporting residents and preventing burnout. And lastly, ensure the quality and standards of care So authorities should instate regular evaluation of the living and working condition at the reception centers. This assessment should include feedback from workers and residents, and the result should be made publicly available. Thank you. Oh.
Well, so we want to now give the word to the discussants, and then we open to a debate, also maybe sharing experiences or point of views from your local. Please, Raffaella, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sabrina, Giulia, Pamela, and thank you to Luc and the VULNER project for having me here. It's really engaging for me because it's the third time I hear you evolving in your reflections. So it's really a privileged position of being here at the end of your long work together as group, as different group from different perspectives. So I feel very much privileged to be here with you today, but for having been with you for most of the VULNER life. So thank you very much. I have two hats here, as you have understood from the presentation. I am indeed the team leader for human mobility at the Belgian Development Agency, and we will say a word on that because in some of the previous occasions we also looked at outside Europe, so it is interesting also to compare and see what happens in similar settings, and I will have a word on that. But first, as Giulia kindly asked, a word coming from a previous experience when working for the European Commission. We put together a study and a group of actors studying exactly the same thing. We started in 2013. We had the final report on 2015. What was the idea at the time? The idea was we were at the beginning, let's say, of the spending review in our member states, and we wanted to see how this would have impacted the working condition of those working in reception and in migration-related services overall, with a specific lens for reception centers, but also on how these changes would have impacted on the lives, on the living condition of those living in those facilities. So exactly the lens you're putting on now. What do you expect now? That I say that we had very different outcomes? Unfortunately not. Unfortunately, we looked at 5 European countries, being Italy, France, Belgium, UK, and Spain. And what we really wanted to look at in terms of impact, therefore, on how the spending review would have impacted the working condition of those working in the centers, and as a result, it was in the quality of information that would have been given on a daily, weekly basis to those living in centers, in the transparency, not of the procedures, because we know well that those working in centers, they have no impact on the procedures, not even lawyers, not even, I mean, we have heard a lot today regarding this, but on the transparency, on the information regarding services available in the member states and accessible to those living in centers, and the support in relation with this national or local regional institution, for instance, procedures to access health services, education services, or others, and access to psychosocial assistance. So these were some of the areas we look at to measure the impact of changing working conditions due to the spending review. And sadly enough, and hearing you speaking, it didn't improve, let's say, in these 10 years, and the conclusion was a bit of the same. The emergency that became structural, so the tertiarization, the privatization of the facility or part of the facilities. We've heard the statistic from Belgium today from Fedasil, and thank you very much, Nicolas, on the beds. But what would be interesting is breaking that down and seeing how many of those beds and of those centers are led directly by FedAsil and how many of those centers are led by other organizations, including private-led organizations, and comparing the standards and comparing the quality of the staff and comparing, etc., because this is where it really gets interesting and it gets important also to put your lens on and compare what happens in some centers and in others. But this apparently became quite structural, the fact of privatizing, tertiarizing, and this we saw at the time had an impact on the selection of the staff, because the institution lost a bit track on how this private organization or profit third sector organization selected their staff, trained their staff, support their staff throughout, granted this supervision and also psychological supervision for the staff, and on the working condition, as you said, contracts that are the shorter and shorter, less secure and project-based most of the time, and the condition of work altogether. So it is very interesting for me to listen to you today, but quite depressing as well. Why do I say depressing? Because this project that was funded by the European Commission and led, among other organizations, by EPSU, but also many employers' federations were involved, was supposed to give room to a nearly basis consultation among actors. So the employers, the trade union organization, refugee-led organization should have, the conclusion of the report and the indication of the European Commission was that we should have had a yearly based monitoring of the evolution of the situation on the evolution of the worsening or not of working condition and therefore impact for the residents in the centers, and a monitoring of sorry, I had 2 points and I cannot find the second. You will forgive me, but there were two. Yeah, so the monitoring of the Commission and the monitoring of the working condition and the monitoring on the impacts of the change in working condition. Obviously, this early consultation never happened, as we hear today, and as I think we will hear from it. So it is important that we keep on raising these issues, because the quality and the capacity to respect the commitments and different articles of the directive that compel us to ensure a certain quality standard really also depends on the quality of working condition of workers. But just one more minute, because I want to put on my hat as a development cooperation actor, to say that in a previous VULNER conference, we also looked at the role and the perception of the role of workers in refugee settings outside Europe. And what is really interesting there, and what we discussed together, is we see exactly, and as a development actors, this I can confirm, because we see it, we see this commitment of workers for the well-being, but also for the good outcome of the procedure of those who reside in centers or in settlements, yet a very big frustration for the disconnect that exists between the quality of the efforts of the workers also towards a good integration. So as we heard this morning from Zoe, I think pushing residents to go attend language training for those who can work, to in fact look for work even on a temporary basis, and the big disconnect between this and anything that is related to the procedure. So the work and the effort that is put for granting good conditions, for ensuring that people try and integrate to the maximum extent possible, completely disconnected from the rest. And this connects very much to what we have heard at the beginning of the afternoon with the time. So the longer the time, the more also the efforts that is put in by the workers and frustration that is generated. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Please, Tuscany, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting EPSU to be part of this very important discussion. As was said, my name is Tuscany Bell, and I'm responsible for social services and youth at EPSU, which is the European Federation of Public Service Trade Unions. In my social services portfolio, I work mainly in elderly care and childcare, so not so much in migration services. That's mainly my colleague Nadia, who unfortunately couldn't be here today. So I'm going to do my best in her absence, but if you have difficult questions, I might have to just refer them to her and come back to you. But I would start by saying that we really welcome this report. As Raffaella explained, we kind of hope to be involved in this monitoring of the situation and similar research, but unfortunately the employers in the EU Sectoral Social Dialogue Committee were not so keen to do that, or we couldn't anyway get them to be involved in that. And so it's very positive to see that this kind of issue is being picked up and that more research is being done. So positive in that sense, negative in the sense that, as Raffaella said, a lot of the concerns and the issues that were identified already in 2015 or 2013 to 2015 still seem to be the case now. So in particular, the lack of staff, which has been addressed very thoroughly in the report, and the impact that this has on the services provided for refugees, migrants, asylum seekers, and indeed on their welfare and their futures, in fact. So I think that the link is quite clear between the staff shortages and the services provided. It was also reported by our French affiliate, who kind of found that having understaffed migration services would de facto create more undocumented migrants. And if we have this link, then we kind of need to look at the reasons behind the staff shortages and question why we have such high levels of staff shortages. And of course, one of the biggest reasons, which is identified in the report, is the underfunding, the cutting back from migration services, the disengagement of states, the under-resourcing, and also in many countries you have closing down of migration services completely. And then this puts an even bigger burden on the remaining centres, the remaining workforce, and the remaining resources. And in addition to the underfunding of the service in general, this means that then the workers are underpaid and undervalued as well. And this makes it very hard for them to do their job. And as Raffaella, I think, pointed out, is that a lot of workers in this service do it because they care. They want to provide a good service. And when they can't, this creates an emotional burden, which leads to a kind of ethical burnout or a moral burnout, forcing workers to leave the sector, which then further perpetuates the staff shortages. And the strenuous nature of the work, the low pay, the undervaluing, it makes it very hard to recruit and retain new workers. And one thing that you picked up in the report that I think is very important is the high turnover of the staff and the impact this has on the services because there's such discontinuity and the time it takes new workers to develop the skills, the knowledge, the expertise to really deliver high quality services. But it's also worth noting, I think, that the migration and asylum rules are also very fast changing. And the workers have to keep up with these rules. And sadly, we see partially driven by the European Commission, more and more restrictive migration and asylum policies. In EPSU, we advocate, obviously, for a humane EU migration asylum policy, and we push for improvements of the EU Single Work Permit Directive and Long-Term Residency Directive. We've been quite critical of recent EU Commission initiatives, such as the Skills Talent Package or Talent Pool, which really kind of resemble these very outdated models of labour migration, where the employers go to a country and say, we want this, this, and this worker because that's what we're missing. And so it doesn't improve the working conditions, it just means that migrants are subject to these substandard working conditions. So I think one more thing to pick up that you again also pick up in your report is the privatisation of migration services. And in 2017, EPSU published a report with Public Service International, which is our global federation, looking at the increasing privatization of migration services. And what's interesting, although kind of worrying, is that a lot of the big corporate actors in the privatization of migration services are the same as those in the privatization of prison services. So this kind of mentality of outsourcing, well, detention, basically, for vulnerable people is a worry, and I would recommend you read the report. I think it could be quite useful. And I think the mentality of outsourcing asylum responsibilities can also be seen at EU level by the EU, with their outsourcing of migration services to third countries, and outsourcing of that fundamental responsibility to welcome and to care for migrants. So, yeah, I think a lot of the issues I've raised, you've also raised. Just another thing that I will mention is that in response to a lot of these issues, EPSU created an EU care network. So it's made up of doctors, nurses, medical assistants, intercultural mediators, asylum and migration officers, but also police officers, border guards, social and educational workers. So a lot of the actors involved in migration services to kind of continue building on this commitment towards hospitality of migrants and asylum seekers and refugees rather than hostility. So to share practices and to see what can be done across Europe. So I will just end by saying that we're very happy with the recommendations that you made. We had a few more, kind of based on the research that Raffaella did and in our own work. So firstly would be to limit or even reverse the privatization of migration services. Secondly, we think there should be a mention to social dialogue, so involving the workers in migration services in the decisions and in the policy making. And at EU level as well, to consult the EU sectoral social dialogue committees, for example, in central government, like we did the research with Raffaella, and also in social services, which is a new sectoral social dialogue committee which will be created hopefully next month. The third is that the EU fundamental right to good administration should also apply to migration services, and this should be face-to-face services for those dealing with asylum applications. Fourth, to recognise that digitalisation can create some opportunities, but it also carries a lot of risks, especially where, you know, as you say, there are so many vulnerabilities of these people, and you can't recognise those if you don't have in-person services as well. And lastly, that there needs to be much more public investment across all public services, because there's such a kind of, as I said, like a link with medical services, with education services, with all the different services. So they were the points that I have. I'll stop there. As I said, I'm filling in, so don't ask difficult questions, but that's all. Thank you very much.
So I would open up for the discussion now. We have 15 minutes. I just wanted to emphasize, as indeed we had to go back to the EPSO report from 2015 to find some, you know, solid and comparative literature on this topic. We, Pamela and Giulia in particular, put a lot of effort in finding other sources, but in the meantime, not much has been done. So the invitation to Raffaella and Tuscany today here is not just because of the relationship binding her to the project, but also because this is indeed one of the most valid and relevant still now sources. But I think that report was not about accommodation centers for migrants, only, it was in general about services for migrants. So I remember very much front desk interaction with migrants with a regular status, for example. I mean, they go there for renewing their, make applications, do kind of, you know. So quite a different kind of report in a sense. Does anyone wants to make a question, a comment? Yeah, based on, yeah, of course, over your national context, especially, or the organization, the experience from the organization you're working in for people from NGOs.
Yeah, thank you very much for these findings. I have one question. If we talk about also professional skills and professional education, we have also to ask where can we find it, and is there an infrastructure who offers this, because it is a quite also complicating and also field, and we have very different capabilities and knowledges which must be transferred. And from the German perspective, I know it is not so easy to find the places for the professional training in this field. And at the second level, you have to ask what are the additional costs, because if the staff is trained better, as you mentioned it, they also will ask for a higher, higher wages, and this is also something which in the system as a whole may be also discussed. And when you mentioned with that those are the same actors as in prisons, I think that is not surprising, because the same services are asked, and there are not so many enterprises who will offer these services. And we, in Germany, we have the third sector organizations, the big ones, who will offer this, but that may be different from country to country.
Okay, we collect maybe more questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My question will be about the power dynamics between in different NGOs and institutions. Let me open up a bit. In Greece, for the social workers, IOM can have social workers, or different NGOs can have social workers, so they are doing the same job but usually having different payments and salaries. And especially in the camp areas, when they know that when they are doing exactly the same job but getting paid significantly different from each other, sometimes can cause certain discontent, but also with relations with EASO, for example, and so on. Depending on the institution they are working, their power and authority can be different in relation to those authorities. So did you notice that kind of power dynamics in your research?
Okay, thank you for making this point. Any other issue or comment or?
Thank you so much for your explanations. You mentioned at some point trauma and secondary trauma from the social workers. So have you noticed any system in place to help them support, either being it state support, which I expect not, or between the workers themselves to have kind of like discussions, topics, self-help groups and so forth?
So maybe we close the round of questions for now. I'll start myself for maybe giving some answers. I think, I mean, at least for what concerns the Italians setting, estimates also from, you know, personal knowledge from people we spoke with, in a typical center you would have half of the people that has some training. That could be people who have a BA in education studies, or people who have a BA as a social worker, social work studies. So maybe not that specific on migration, that could also be, but still some education, and even a smaller number specific on these issues. Half of the other workers just don't have any training. So that's a student job. It's a job they will do instead of working at McDonald's or cafes. You would work in such a place. So we are really getting to the bottom level of what it means not training in such a tough situation. So I would say that also the resources they have as skills in giving them each other support increase if they have an education in how to do that. But for people who are there just for a couple of months, that's not the case. And I also want to say that this might also affect the power dynamics, and we are talking about a very heterogeneous landscape. Giulia tried to give a list of the type of professions that there. We are using this umbrella term, social work, that took us a lot of discussion on what was the best English word to describe this complex situation. We ended up using that social work, but to be clear, indeed, those that have a title or like entitlement as a degree, as a social worker it's just a small percentage. It's all people working in the field. So I'll give the mic back to you.
Yeah, thanks for your comments and your questions. I'll just add something. Well, we tried to see whether, we did all kind of after the end of the fieldwork and stuff, we tried to see whether there were organizations working from a social work, from a reception center workers' perspective on the rights. And we did find that there is some grassroots groups which are in some cases linked to grassroots trade unions and trying to give support on a contract level, because there is really a lot of abuses. We can say clearly, because in fact there is national contracts that are not necessarily enforced. And of course there is a situation in which there is not the question of trauma, where there is absolutely no support whatsoever. So I think we can say that I don't have the numbers, because part of the problem is the problem. Part of what we found out is that also there is not much research on this topic, which to us seemed like to be a very important topic when you want to actually, address issues of access to rights to asylum, and especially for vulnerable people. So yes, there is many diverse also salaries, because there is diverse types of employers. For us, for Italy, in the case of Italy, it's mostly co-ops, so cooperatives. In that sense, is a third. It's an officially. It's in between profit and non-profit, but it is in fact profit. It can be run in a very profit way, but it has also some of the problems related to the fact that it has kind of a non-profit cover. Let's put it like that. But I think Pamela can add something.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Yes, just to make clear, if I can, we are focusing on CAS facilities that hosted 7 out of 10 migrants and are hosting asylum seekers. In Italy, there's another system, the national official system, where refugees are hosted. So people arrived, stay, more of them in the CAS. Sorry, not more of them, all of them with the new law, with the Cutro law, all of them staying in the CAS. And the problem is there, because they stay there 2, 3, 4 years, it depends, the time of the procedure. And the funding for the CAS have been cut, so there are not support for social workers for them. In the official system where refugees are hosted, there are psychological supervision, usually once a month, with all the equipe involved who take care of refugees hosted. But in this system, in the CAS system, no. Results show that also basic service like language mediator, health support have been cut, or officially they are not cut, but concretely social workers have no time to deal with this issue. This is about the support for social workers, and I think that the other questions my colleagues have already answered, so I will give the mic to my colleagues. Thank you.
Any particular comment?
Oh, okay. Okay.
Do you want to add anything else? Any last clarification? Question, comment? We are speaking, of course, from an Italian standpoint, knowing that the problem might be similar in some other countries. Of course, the fact that there is no research about that, at the European level. at the European level makes difficult also for us to make statements about other countries in a comparative manner, but this invisibility of these workers. Sophie, please.
Just to agree with you, from the Ugandan perspective, they have, sorry. I'm Sophie, I'm also part of the VULNER group. I just wanted to give a comparative perspective from the Ugandan side. Because of the critical funding limitations, there's a high turnover, projects get closed. So most of the time the care workers, the social workers or humanitarian workers are more worried about keeping their own jobs than the refugees, you know? So of course they want to attend to them, but they're also worried about what it means for them. So because of the high turnover, it's also difficult for the refugee to come back and only hear that that person no longer works there, you know? And in terms of how they cope, you asked about a question, because of the very gruesome stories they hear, one psychosocial worker said he has to pray before he talks to the refugees because he was getting nightmares because of all these gruesome stories they were telling him. And he was afraid sometimes to face them, but he said when he would pray, he would feel a bit better. And the refugees, in the end, said that he was a better social worker because he was praying with them. Yeah, I could give you several stories, but I just wanted to say that it's the same.
We also collected similar stories, yes. Yeah, also during our workshop, you remember, there was a moment in the workshop in November that in the audience, there was a debate. There was actually one of my students, and he started to cry because his weekend job was to work in those centers, and listening to our presentations, he got moved. So that's our curiosity, let's say, to work more on this issue. So thank you so much for your attention. I know that at 6:30 we have another important speaker. So this is the most difficult speaking session ever. I don't see anything.